Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. This is week 7, chapter 6 in History 2010, and this week we're talking about the American Revolution, which is exciting. And I think one good way to think about this is that the independence movement in the colonies was really a loose-knit movement, and it didn't have buy-in from the colonists. So, it's estimated that only about only about 1/3 of the population was loyal to the patriot cause. So let me kind of frame this and start back at the beginning so you know what I'm talking about. So obviously the 13 colonies are ruled by Britain prior to 1776. And because of some of the things we talked about last week, like Enlightenment thinking about independence, and this notion that Parliament was unfairly taxing the colonists, all of these things, these ideas and events really led to an inevitable revolution, if you will. So, the revolution begins, the battle part begins up in New England, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, so you'll read about that. And really, on the part of the patriots, that's the colonists, the good guys, I guess, the Americans. On the part of the patriots, they make several overtures towards Great Britain to say, hey, back off and everything will be cool. So you'll read something about the olive branch petition in the text, and I just think it's important to understand that the patriots didn't go into this war thinking, oh, this is going to be a great thing and we should do it. They actually were worried about battling the British because at the time the British were the premier superpower in the world. But the thing is, at the time also, in the 1700s, there's no modern communication, there's no modern transportation. So, the Brits, the English, really have to send a contingent army over to North America to defend the colonies and to fight the revolution. So there's lots of logistical problems with the British, and you'll read about the various battles and how initially George Washington, who's the commander of the Patriot Army, is defeated in New York and New Jersey and retreats and really takes advantage of the guerrilla-style tactics of the Patriot Army. The Patriots fought, in the woods behind buildings and used all of those guerrilla tactics against a very regimented and formal strategy that the British would use. And because the Patriots were kind of scrappy that way, the British really weren't prepared to fight them. And the way it turned out was that the British has a huge advantage militarily over the Americans or the Patriots, but when France comes in on the side of the colonies, it really changes the way that the war shakes out and really gives some legitimacy to the cause of the Patriots, because now all of a sudden the Patriots are recognized by France. So, go ahead and read through it. I don't know that made a lot of sense, but go ahead and read through it because, the war part is fascinating, that the colonists were able to defeat the British. And considering the Patriot Army, the colonist army, I mean, a lot of these guys were farmers. They'd fight for a few months and then go back home to farm. They didn't have, uniforms and supplies and that sort of thing in many cases, sort of lived off the land. And that's a story of a heroic effort amongst the colonists. Now, at the same time, the attitude of the Patriot Army, was not that of a professional army, and it wasn't great. I mean, the Patriot Army, in the colonies, our army in the colonies, certainly was not always ethical as far as, what they took from the countryside and how they treated people in the countryside and their loyalty to freed African Americans and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of moving pieces here. And again, if you carefully read the book, look at my highlights and look at some of my notes, some of the more important things hopefully I've pulled out. But it is complicated. Really considering, what happened, and you just go through my reading notes, but again, the colonists didn't get into the war easily. They wanted to avoid the war, but King George III and Parliament had no interest in appeasing any of the colonists. There are various events that happen that really enhance this ideology of freedom that we talked about last week. So you're going to read about a guy named Thomas Paine. He wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense in 1776, which, no modern communications, but Common Sense was a short book, and it talked about all the reasons for independence from Britain, and it was wildly popular. And so Thomas Paine's work got people kind of fired up against the British, if you will. And the Declaration of Independence is penned by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, which is really a declaration of war. And it lays out all of the problems that the colonists have with King George. So, after the Declaration of Independence, the gloves were off and war was inevitable. One of the things that the book talks a lot about, and one of the things that is going to be critical for your essay question this week, is sort of the contradictions of the revolution and this idea that who was going to be loyal to the colonist. And that's an interesting part to this story because, the British came into the colonies and, said to slaves basically, hey, if you fight on our side if you rise up and fight on our side against your American slaveholders, we guarantee you freedom. So that was also the case with the Native Americans. The English were trying to align with the Native Americans to fight against the colonists. But those alignments were tenuous at best and kept collapsing. And one of the reasons for that is that with no modern communications, there couldn't be a widespread movement, either for the colonists or for the British or against the British. So, all of these pockets of loyalty to various sides were really geographically isolated, so no big movement rose up. In other words, what if all of the slaves said, hey, we're going to fight on the side of the British, we're going to rise up and attack our plantation owners and in exchange for freedom. So, what if that would have happened? But it didn't, and it didn't happen with the Native Americans that way either. There were split alliances, so everything was kind of a mess, and there was no big uniform plan for backing the colonists or for backing the British. So again, read through that. And I won't go through the battles right now, but George Washington obviously is the first commander-in-chief of the Army before he's president. He's very successful at it, and read about his battles, especially at Yorktown, where Cornwallis, the Brit, surrenders. That's obviously an important part of the Revolution. And also a couple of notes I made, like the book talks about the Patriot militia, and the idea, the American legacy is that, the farmers and workers and craftsmen, all grab their rifles and come together to fight for the country against the British. This idea of a militia, not really an organized army, but a militia of people that come forward, armed militia, is really the basis for the Second Amendment. So I put that in the reading notes. You should know that. And again, even today, when we talk about sort of the legacy of the American Revolution, this idea of a well-armed militia sticks around and really results in, the people that are carrying, weapons on the streets and open carry laws and the people that you see out protesting that are armed. It's really a legacy of this idea of a well-regulated militia. And that is one of the contradictions to the war. So the essay question this week is just that. What are the contradictions of the American Revolution and what is its legacy? And that's a really tough question. But actually, if you go into section 6.7 in your text in MindTap, it really talks about it. So one way you could approach this, the major contradiction of the American Revolution is obvious, because the revolution is fighting for freedom from Parliament. And this idea, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, that is a resounding part of the American Revolution. But at the same time, the contradiction is that slaves are still enslaved after the Revolution, so all men are created equal isn't working there, and women have no rights after the Revolution whatsoever. So again, those are two huge contradictions. This idea that we're fighting for liberty and freedom and all men are created equal, but at the same time, the very patriots who are writing these things are slaveholders. and are discriminatory towards women. So that's a big contradiction. A legacy of the American Revolution could be an ongoing struggle for freedom with these other groups. So you could answer it that way. Another legacy of the Revolution could be the right to bear arms and this idea of a well-regulated militia. So when you read 6.7 in the book, which is just a section of a page, kind of go through there, and I'll give you some guidance in the rubric, but go through and identify one or two contradictions and one or two legacies of the American Revolution. And then, also another part of the essay is, how do you think moving forward, so chapters ahead of where we're at now, how do you think this rhetoric of all men are created equal as a rallying cry for the American cause, what do you think this does to the cause of slavery and the cause of women's rights? And so there's no answer for this in the book. It's really sort of your opinion. But I mean, think about that for a minute. If this all men are created equal is sort of the big meme for the country after the revolution, how are people going to start thinking about slavery and start thinking about women with that legacy of equality hanging over them? What's going to happen? What are the possible outcomes to this? So I want you to think about that. These are really vague questions. You won't find the answers in the book, but I hope that as you read through and look at everything, you'll be able to formulate some responses that make sense. So that's it for this week, and I wish you the best of luck in your essay, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. Bye.